Lock the containment doors, right now. Dr. Elijah Brooks's voice cut across the control room with such force that every conversation stopped at once. Dozens of engineers turned toward him. Fingers froze above keyboards. Coffee cups hovered halfway to waiting lips. For one impossible heartbeat, the only sound inside Palo Verde nuclear generating station was the low mechanical hum of thousands of machines doing exactly what they had done every second for years. Then Richard Coleman slowly looked up from the main reactor console, his expression carrying the calm confidence of a man who had spent 3 decades believing he had seen every problem a nuclear plant could possibly produce. He didn't rush. He didn't panic. He simply stared at the young black engineer standing beside the digital reactor display, watching Elijah's eyes instead of the alarming numbers flashing across the screen. "Explain yourself," Richard said, his voice measured enough to quiet the room even further. Elijah didn't hesitate. Core temperature isn't the problem. The neutron flux oscillation is drifting outside the predicted stability envelope. The sensors aren't failing. They're warning us. If we don't begin an emergency shutdown now, we're going to lose control of the reactor. Several supervisors exchanged skeptical glances. One technician quietly shook his head. Another whispered, "He's overreacting." Richard folded his arms. "Our systems show every primary safety margin remains within operational limits." Elijah stepped closer to the display wall, pointing toward a cluster of graphs that barely moved enough for an untrained eye to notice. "Not individually," he replied. "Look at all 5 variables together. The pressure fluctuations, coolant density, neutron delay fraction, vibration harmonics, and thermal imbalance. They're forming a pattern." Richard barely looked at the charts. "I don't see a pattern." "Because you're looking at them separately." Elijah swallowed once before continuing. "I modeled this exact sequence during Navy reactor simulations. Every number looks harmless until they synchronize." Helen Mercer, director of plant operations, finally spoke from across the room. "You're asking us to scram a reactor that supplies electricity to millions of people based on what you call a pattern?" Elijah nodded without flinching. "I'm asking you to trust the math before physics makes the decision for us." A quiet laugh escaped someone near the back of the room. It spread just enough to make several others lower their eyes. Richard sighed heavily. "Do you understand what you're recommending? An emergency shutdown costs millions of dollars, triggers federal investigations, and disrupts the regional power grid." "I understand exactly what's at stake," Elijah answered. "That's why I'm asking now instead of 30 seconds from now." Richard walked toward him until only a few feet separated them. The overhead LED lights reflected against the polished floor, casting sharp white lines between the two men. Around them, nearly 200 employees watched without speaking. "You've been here 14 months, Richard said quietly. "I've been running facilities like this longer than you've been alive." Elijah met his eyes without raising his voice. "The reactor doesn't care how old either of us is." The sentence hung in the air like a suspended weight. Helen's face tightened. "That's enough." She turned toward the security desk. "Deactivate Dr. Brooks's system credentials immediately." Elijah blinked. "What?" A security officer hesitated. "Ma'am? You heard me." Helen never looked away from Elijah. "Disable his reactor access. Effective now." Across the room, one monitor flickered yellow before returning to green. A single warning tone echoed softly through the control room, so brief that most people ignored it. Elijah heard it immediately. His heartbeat accelerated. "Listen to me," he said, taking one careful step forward. "That's the first harmonic alarm." Richard raised one hand. "Escort him out." 2 security officers approached politely but firmly. One of them almost sounded apologetic. "Dr. Brooks, we need you to come with us." Elijah looked past them toward the reactor display. Another tiny warning icon appeared near the coolant stability graph. Almost nobody noticed except him. "Please," he said, his voice no longer carrying anger but urgency. "Lock the containment doors before the oscillation reaches critical synchronization." Richard turned his back without answering. The security officers gently guided Elijah toward the massive reinforced control room entrance. As the steel door slid open, cold air from the service corridor rushed inside. Elijah looked back one last time. Nearly every engineer had already returned to their workstation. Some avoided looking at him altogether. Others simply assumed the crisis had passed. The heavy security door closed with a deep metallic thud. A green light above the electronic lock instantly turned red. Access revoked flashed across Elijah's identification badge. He stared through the thick, reinforced glass at the room he could no longer enter. Inside, Richard calmly resumed reviewing reactor data. Outside, Elijah slowly lifted his wristwatch. Under his breath, almost too quietly for even himself to hear, he whispered, "You have less than 1 minute." Outside the reinforced control room, the silence felt heavier than the thick concrete walls surrounding the reactor itself. Dr. Elijah Brooks stood motionless, his revoked identification badge still hanging from his neck, its tiny red light blinking every few seconds like a reminder that authority could disappear far faster than knowledge. Through the reinforced glass, he watched engineers moving from console to console, completely unaware that every passing second narrowed the margin between stability and catastrophe. He closed his eyes for only a moment, and another control room from another time came rushing back into his memory. It had not been surrounded by Arizona desert or commercial power lines stretching toward distant cities. It had been buried beneath the steel hull of a United States Navy submarine, where every decision carried the weight of hundreds of lives beneath thousands of feet of ocean. Back then, his instructor had never raised his voice. Commander Michael Hayes believed panic was contagious, but discipline was stronger. During one simulation years earlier, the commander had quietly disabled several monitoring systems before turning toward a room full of nervous trainees. "Never wait for every alarm," he had said. "By the time every alarm agrees with you, physics has already made the decision." Most students had searched desperately for flashing warning lights. Elijah had looked at the trends instead. Tiny changes, fractions of a degree, slight pressure differences, nearly invisible shifts that only became dangerous when connected together like pieces of the same puzzle. When the simulation ended, Commander Hayes had walked directly to Elijah's station. "You were the only one watching the story, instead of the numbers," he had said with a proud smile. "Machines report facts. Engineers discover meaning." Those words had stayed with Elijah long after he completed his service. They stayed with him through graduate school at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. They stayed with him during endless nights studying reactor dynamics, while classmates memorized equations without asking why they behaved the way they did. They stayed with him when recruiters questioned whether someone his age possessed enough experience to oversee commercial nuclear systems. And they stayed with him every single morning he entered Palo Verde, where proving himself sometimes seemed harder than solving engineering problems. On his first day at the plant, one senior employee had smiled politely before asking, "Which maintenance crew are you assigned to?" Elijah had simply answered, "Reactor Systems Engineering." The surprised silence that followed had spoken louder than the question itself. Over the following months, he earned respect from many coworkers through long hours, careful calculations, and an almost impossible attention to detail. Lisa Nguyen had noticed first. She often joked that Elijah treated reactor data the way musicians treated sheet music. "You hear things inside numbers," she once told him while reviewing maintenance reports. Elijah had laughed softly. "Numbers do not lie. People just stop listening before they finish talking." Even Daniel Foster, who rarely complimented anyone, had admitted one evening during a 12-hour maintenance shift, "You catch problems before the software does. I do not know how you see half this stuff." Elijah had answered honestly, "Because I never look for confirmation. I look for contradictions." That habit had become almost instinctive. Every morning began the same way. Before sunrise painted the Arizona mountains with pale orange light, Elijah arrived carrying nothing more than a travel mug of black coffee and a notebook filled with handwritten observations. He rarely trusted automatic summaries. Instead, he compared overnight trends line by line, searching for patterns too small to trigger formal reports. Most days, he found nothing unusual. That was exactly how nuclear safety was supposed to work. Quiet, predictable, uneventful. But this morning had felt different from the moment he opened the overnight performance logs. 5 unrelated measurements had drifted by margins so small that no automated safety system considered them significant. Independently, each value remained comfortably inside federal operating standards. Together, however, They formed a sequence he recognized instantly from years of studying unstable reactor behavior. He had checked every equation twice, then 3 times. He even recalibrated the software model using archived operational data from previous reactor cycles. Every calculation reached the same conclusion. The instability was real, invisible for now, but accelerating beneath the surface. Standing alone outside the control room, Elijah slowly opened the same worn notebook he carried every day. The final page contained only one sentence written months earlier, beneath a quote from Commander Hayes. It read, "The greatest danger is never what everyone sees. It is what everyone decides is too small to matter." Behind the reinforced glass, another yellow indicator silently appeared on the reactor display. Inside the control room, confidence still outweighed concern. Richard Coleman rested both hands on the polished edge of the central operations console, while rows of high-resolution displays painted the room in soft shades of blue and green. Around him, experienced operators continued their routines with practiced precision, entering readings, confirming procedures, and monitoring power output flowing across the southwest electrical grid. To anyone walking through the room, everything appeared exactly as it had thousands of times before. Helen Mercer folded her arms and looked toward the large reactor status wall. "Clear the unnecessary alerts," she instructed. "We are not turning routine fluctuations into a crisis." An operator acknowledged her order with a nod before silencing several advisory notifications that had not yet reached mandatory reporting thresholds. The room settled again into its familiar rhythm. Richard glanced toward Daniel Foster. "Run another diagnostic on the instrumentation package. I want confirmation that we are looking at healthy sensors instead of electrical noise." Daniel immediately began typing commands into his workstation. Several seconds later, new data streamed across his display. "Instrumentation passed self-validation," he reported. "No hardware faults detected." Richard gave a satisfied nod. "Exactly what I expected." Helen allowed herself a faint smile. Sometimes young engineers become too attached to theoretical models. Operating a commercial reactor is different from solving equations in a classroom. A few nearby supervisors quietly agreed. One senior engineer leaned back in his chair and said, "The reactor has survived heat waves, monsoon storms, and grid instability. It is not going to fail because 5 graphs moved a fraction of a percent." Light laughter spread through one corner of the room before fading beneath the steady hum of ventilation systems. Beyond the thick glass wall, Elijah remained visible in the corridor, standing perfectly still with his notebook held against his side. Richard noticed him but deliberately looked away. "We cannot allow one person's imagination to override decades of operational discipline," he said. "The worst decisions are made when people panic." At nearly the same moment, another soft warning tone echoed through the room. It lasted less than 2 seconds before disappearing. Lisa Nguyen slowly turned toward her monitor. A thin yellow line had drifted slightly farther than before. She frowned and enlarged the graph. The movement remained small, almost insignificant, but something about its timing unsettled her. She opened another display and overlaid the coolant density trend with the neutron flux data. The lines seemed unrelated until she adjusted the timescale. Her eyes narrowed. "Daniel," she called quietly, "can you compare vibration harmonics with reactor pressure over the last 20 minutes? Daniel shrugged. "Sure." Within moments, another chart appeared. He stared at it for several seconds before speaking. "That is unusual." Lisa looked toward him. "You see it too?" "Maybe." He hesitated. "The peaks are beginning to align." Richard overheard the exchange and walked toward their workstations. "What is it?" Daniel answered carefully. "Nothing outside operating limits." Lisa added, "Individually, no. Together." She stopped before finishing the sentence. Richard looked at both displays for less than 5 seconds before shaking his head. Coincidence. Data alignment happens all the time. Lisa did not respond immediately. Instead, she quietly opened historical reactor archives dating back several years. She searched for operating cycles that displayed similar synchronization. Hundreds of records appeared. One by one, she eliminated them. None matched the current progression. A cool sensation settled across her shoulders, despite the constant 70-degree temperature maintained inside the control room. She remembered something Elijah had told her months earlier while reviewing maintenance trends late one evening. "The most dangerous pattern is the one you have never seen before," he had said. "History cannot warn you about an event that has not happened yet." Another notification appeared. This time it remained on the screen instead of disappearing automatically. The yellow indicator slowly shifted toward amber. Across the room, one operator quietly cleared his throat. Coolant flow variance increased another 0.3%. Richard answered without turning around. "Still acceptable." Another voice followed. Primary vibration increased again. Helen remained composed. "Continue monitoring." Then another operator spoke. "Neutron oscillation frequency just changed." The room became noticeably quieter. Nobody laughed now. Keyboards slowed. Coffee cups remained untouched. Eyes moved from individual monitors toward the massive display wall, where several yellow indicators had begun gathering in different corners of the reactor overview. Outside the reinforced glass, Elijah lifted his eyes from his wristwatch and looked directly toward the growing cluster of warning lights. He did not smile. He did not appear angry. He simply whispered to himself, "The synchronization has started." The atmosphere inside the control room changed so gradually that no one could point to the exact second confidence began giving way to doubt. It started with silence. Conversations faded. Chairs stopped rolling across the polished floor. The steady rhythm of keyboards slowed as more engineers abandoned routine reports and fixed their attention on the growing collection of amber indicators spreading across the main reactor display. Richard Coleman remained standing at the center console, refusing to let uncertainty show on his face. "Status update," he said firmly. Daniel Foster looked from one monitor to another before answering. "Primary coolant flow has drifted another 0.5%. Still inside operating limits." "Reactor vessel vibration?" Richard asked. "Increasing, but not beyond required action thresholds." Helen Mercer folded her hands together. "Exactly. We are still within every federal operating requirement." Lisa Wen did not respond. Her eyes remained locked on the overlapping trend graphs covering her workstation. One by one, she synchronized every data stream using the same timing sequence Elijah had tried to demonstrate earlier. As the graphs aligned, her expression slowly changed. The lines were no longer moving independently. They were beginning to pulse together like instruments following the same invisible conductor. She leaned closer to the screen and whispered almost to herself, "This cannot be happening." Daniel glanced toward her monitor. "What do you see?" Lisa pointed at the synchronized curves. "Look at the interval spacing." Daniel narrowed his eyes. Several seconds passed before he quietly answered, "The oscillations are accelerating." Richard heard only the last sentence. "Accelerating does not mean dangerous." Lisa took a slow breath. "Not by themselves," Richard interrupted. "Exactly." She looked directly at him, but together. Her voice stopped. She remembered Elijah finishing that exact thought less than 10 minutes earlier. Richard looked away before she could continue. "Run another predictive model." Daniel immediately entered a new command. The simulation processed thousands of calculations in seconds before displaying its projection across the lower corner of the screen. Daniel frowned. "That is strange." Helen stepped closer. "What changed?" The confidence interval widened. Richard answered before Daniel could. "Models become unstable whenever data fluctuates. That is normal." Daniel hesitated. "This model normally tightens as more information comes in." Nobody answered him. Another alert sounded, louder than before. This one remained active. A second amber notification appeared beside the coolant circulation panel. Then another appeared beneath neutron monitoring. The warning lights no longer looked isolated. They formed a chain, stretching across multiple systems that had never shown simultaneous irregularities during normal operation. Outside the reinforced glass, Elijah watched every new indicator appear almost exactly when he expected. His notebook remained open in one hand, while his other hand rested lightly against the cold steel door. He was no longer trying to get anyone's attention. He knew they could already see what he had seen. The question was whether they would understand it before the remaining margin disappeared. Inside, one of the younger operators nervously cleared his throat. "Sir, I have another deviation." Richard turned immediately. "Report it." Heat transfer efficiency dropped another 0.4%. Helen looked toward the display. Compensate with flow adjustment. The operator entered the command. Everyone watched the numbers. For a brief moment, the values appeared to stabilize. A quiet sigh spread through several workstations. Then the graphs moved again. This time, the adjustment produced an unexpected response somewhere else in the system. Daniel stared at the new data in disbelief. The correction increased the neutron oscillation. Lisa immediately checked another monitor, and reactor pressure just followed it. Richard's confidence finally showed its first crack. Run the calculation again. Daniel did. The result returned exactly the same. Lisa opened Elijah's earlier report that had been automatically archived after his credentials were revoked. She compared his handwritten projections with the live reactor data. One timestamp after another matched almost perfectly. Every tiny shift he had predicted was unfolding in the exact sequence he had warned about. Her heartbeat quickened. She whispered, "He did not guess." Daniel looked at her. "What?" She swallowed before answering. He calculated all of this before it happened. At that exact moment, the main display emitted a sharp, continuous tone, unlike any previous notification. Several amber indicators changed to flashing red simultaneously. Every conversation stopped. Every pair of eyes lifted toward the towering reactor status wall. Richard Coleman stood frozen for the first time that morning as the automated system displayed a message no one inside the room had expected to see. Predictive stability margin rapidly decreasing. Estimated safe response window, 40 seconds. The piercing alarm echoed through the control room without interruption now, its sharp electronic tone cutting through every remaining trace of confidence. Bright red indicators spread across the massive reactor display one after another, each new warning appearing faster than the last. Nobody laughed anymore. Nobody whispered. Every engineer stared at the screens, as if willing the numbers to reverse themselves. Daniel Foster swallowed hard while comparing the latest readings against the predictive model. His voice sounded different now, stripped of certainty. The instability is feeding itself. Richard Coleman stepped closer to the central display. "How much time?" Daniel hesitated before answering. The system estimates less than 40 seconds before automatic protective actions begin. If they fail to stabilize the oscillations, he stopped speaking. He did not need to finish the sentence. Everyone in the room understood what uncontrolled instability inside a nuclear reactor could mean, even if multiple layers of safety systems still stood ready to prevent the worst outcome. Helen Mercer immediately issued another order. Increase coolant circulation by 2%. The operator complied within seconds. Pumps adjusted. Valves responded. Fresh numbers raced across the displays. For one brief moment, several indicators moved in the right direction. Then the improvement disappeared. A new warning appeared beside the neutron flux monitor. Daniel stared in disbelief. The correction shifted the oscillation again. Lisa Nguyen rapidly compared the latest readings with Elijah's archived calculations. Her breathing became noticeably faster as every prediction continued unfolding with astonishing precision. The projected sequence, the timing, even the interaction between unrelated systems matched almost perfectly. She turned toward Richard. "We need to bring him back." Richard did not answer. His eyes remained fixed on the growing field of red notifications. Lisa stepped closer. "He already solved this." Helen shook her head. "We have experienced operators in this room." Lisa refused to back away. "None of us predicted this." Another continuous tone erupted from the reactor monitoring wall. The automated advisory changed again. Recommended operator action. Immediate stability intervention. Daniel looked directly at Richard. "Sir, the software is no longer suggesting observation." Richard finally spoke, but his voice carried none of its earlier confidence. "Run every approved emergency stabilization procedure." Operators moved immediately. Commands flowed across keyboards. Cooling parameters changed. Control rod positioning adjusted within authorized limits. Power distribution shifted to reduce reactor demand. Every action followed established procedure exactly as years of training required. Yet the numbers refused to cooperate. Each correction produced another unexpected response somewhere else inside the system. It felt less like solving a problem, and more like chasing shadows that changed shape every time someone reached for them. Outside the reinforced door, Elijah Brooks remained perfectly still. Through the thick glass, he could see the room moving faster with every passing second. Engineers crossed between workstations. Supervisors leaned over consoles. The urgency he had tried to prevent had finally arrived. He quietly checked his wristwatch again. 30 seconds. His expression remained calm, but inside his mind, every calculation continued running. He knew exactly why the approved procedures were failing. They were treating individual symptoms instead of the single hidden cause connecting them all. Behind the glass, Lisa suddenly remembered something Elijah had explained during a training session months earlier. If every system starts reacting at the same time, he had said, stop thinking about equipment. Start thinking about timing. Her eyes widened. She rushed back to her workstation and reopened his archived analysis. There it was. A handwritten note she had overlooked earlier. Synchronized control rod insertion with delayed coolant adjustment. Reverse the sequence. She looked up instantly. Richard, he turned. She held the printed page in trembling hands. We have been doing it backward. Richard walked toward her. His eyes scanned Elijah's calculations. Every equation was supported by detailed reactor physics, operational assumptions, and timing intervals measured down to fractions of a second. It was not speculation, it was engineering. Daniel leaned over Lisa's shoulder. He accounted for the feedback loop. Helen stared at the page in silence. Richard slowly lowered the report. For the first time that morning, he looked toward the reinforced glass door where Elijah still stood, waiting outside. Their eyes met across the corridor. There was no anger in Elijah's face, no satisfaction, only quiet urgency. Another loud warning interrupted the silence. Estimated safe response window, 20 seconds. Richard inhaled deeply before giving the order he never imagined he would have to say. Open the door. Bring Dr. Brooks back. Now. The heavy security lock released with a sharp metallic click that seemed louder than every alarm echoing through the control room. The reinforced door slid open, and every pair of eyes turned toward Dr. Elijah Brooks. Nobody spoke. The same people who had watched him escorted out only minutes earlier now stood frozen, waiting for the man they had dismissed to walk back inside. Elijah did not hurry. His steps were steady, measured, almost impossibly calm, despite the flashing red indicators covering the massive reactor display. Richard Coleman met him halfway across the room, his face drained of the confidence that had defined him only moments before. Dr. Brooks, he said quietly, we need your help. Elijah looked directly at him. There was no anger in his expression, no satisfaction, and no desire to remind anyone what had happened. He simply asked, how many seconds? Daniel Foster answered before Richard could. Approximately 18. Elijah nodded once and walked straight to the central console without another word. As he reached the main display, he studied the synchronized warning patterns for less than 3 seconds. The room waited in complete silence. Even the constant electronic alarms seemed to fade beneath the weight of expectation. Elijah placed his notebook beside the keyboard and spoke with absolute clarity. Stop adjusting individual systems. No one moved. Now, he repeated. Richard immediately looked around the room. Do exactly what he says. Operators lifted their hands away from their controls. The frantic stream of corrections stopped. Elijah pointed toward the reactor timing display. The reactor is not fighting us. It is responding to us. Every correction arrives at the wrong moment, pushing the oscillation farther instead of slowing it. Lisa nodded almost immediately. The feedback loop. Elijah looked at her briefly. Exactly. He turned toward Daniel. Prepare manual synchronization sequence. Daniel hesitated only long enough to confirm the instruction. Ready, Elijah continued without raising his voice. Delay coolant adjustment by 4 seconds after partial control rod insertion. Do not reverse the order. Helen Mercer looked at the sequence on her monitor. That is outside our standard emergency procedure. Elijah answered without taking his eyes off the reactor display. Because the standard procedure assumes independent instability. This is synchronized resonance. Richard looked toward Helen. Approve it. She paused for only a heartbeat before giving a slow nod. Approved. The countdown on the predictive display continued falling. 15 seconds, 14, 13. Every engineer in the room focused on Elijah instead of the alarms. He seemed completely unaffected by the pressure surrounding him. His breathing remained steady. His hands never shook. Years of training beneath the ocean and countless hours studying reactor dynamics had prepared him for exactly one thing: trusting physics instead of fear. "Daniel," Elijah said, "begin partial insertion." Daniel pressed the command. The control rods started moving according to Elijah's timing. Hold coolant flow. 4 seconds stretched longer than anyone believed possible. Nobody spoke. Nobody even shifted their weight. The only sounds were cooling fans, warning tones, and the soft mechanical movement deep inside the reactor systems. Elijah watched the countdown. "Now, increase coolant flow exactly 1.2%. The operator executed the adjustment instantly. Every eye jumped toward the reactor display. For one terrifying second, nothing happened. Then the neutron oscillation curve slowed. Lisa leaned closer to her monitor. "It is responding." Daniel stared at another screen. "Pressure is stabilizing." Elijah remained focused. "Maintain sequence. Do not overcorrect." Another few seconds passed. One flashing red indicator changed to amber, then another. The continuous warning tone stopped abruptly, leaving behind a silence so complete that several people instinctively looked around to make sure the speakers had not failed. Across the massive display wall, the predictive stability margin began climbing instead of falling. Reactor vibration gradually settled. Coolant flow synchronized. Thermal imbalance narrowed until the graphs slowly returned toward their expected operating range. One by one, the warning lights disappeared. Nobody celebrated. Nobody applauded. They simply watched the impossible unfold in front of them. Daniel finally broke the silence with a voice barely above a whisper. "The reactor is stable." Lisa looked at Elijah with quiet amazement. "Your calculations were right down to the second." Elijah exhaled slowly, for what felt like the first time in several minutes. He closed his notebook, rested one hand on the edge of the console, and looked across the room where fear had given way to stunned silence. No one could ignore the truth anymore. The data had spoken exactly as he said it would, and the man they had locked outside had become the only reason everyone inside was still standing in a calm and stable control room. The control room remained perfectly still long after the final warning tone disappeared. The familiar hum of cooling systems slowly reclaimed the silence, replacing the relentless alarms that had filled the room only moments before. Green status indicators returned across the massive display wall one by one, each steady light confirming that the reactor had settled back into a safe operating condition. No one cheered. No one sighed with relief. The absence of noise carried far more weight than any celebration could have. Every engineer understood how close they had come to losing control of a situation they had believed was impossible only minutes earlier. Daniel Foster leaned back from his workstation, his hand still resting above the keyboard without touching it. He replayed the event logs on his monitor, comparing the live data with the archived report Elijah had submitted before his credentials were revoked. Every critical transition aligned almost perfectly. The timestamps differed by less than a second. Daniel quietly shook his head. "He predicted every stage," he said. "Every single one." Lisa and Wen looked at the same data and slowly nodded. Not just the outcome, the sequence. Richard Coleman remained standing near the central console, staring at the numbers that had returned to normal. For the first time in his career, the display no longer represented technical information alone. It had become undeniable evidence of a decision that could have ended very differently. He remembered Elijah standing only a few feet away, calmly explaining that 5 harmless-looking measurements formed a single dangerous pattern. Richard had dismissed the warning before even examining the calculations. Now those same calculations filled the monitors around him, proving themselves line after line with uncomfortable precision. Helen Mercer quietly reviewed the official event log generated by the plant's operating system. Every command issued during the emergency had been recorded automatically. The document showed the exact moment Elijah recommended an emergency shutdown. It showed the time his access privileges were revoked. It showed the growing instability while standard procedures failed to stop the resonance. Finally, it showed the manual synchronization sequence Elijah directed after returning to the control room. The timeline left no room for interpretation. Facts had replaced opinion. Helen slowly lowered the report and looked toward Elijah, who was already organizing his notebook instead of accepting congratulations. "Dr. Brooks," she said softly, "your analysis prevented a very serious situation." Elijah simply closed his notebook. The team carried out the procedure exactly as instructed. That is why it worked. Lisa looked at him with genuine admiration. Most people would have walked away after what happened. Elijah offered a faint smile. "The reactor did not care about my feelings. It only cared whether someone understood what it was doing." Several engineers lowered their eyes after hearing those words. A few exchanged uncomfortable glances, remembering how quickly they had accepted the assumption that Elijah was overreacting. One older operator slowly walked toward him. "I owe you an apology," he admitted. "When they escorted you out, I thought you were making the situation worse." Elijah answered with quiet honesty. "You trusted the information you had." The operator shook his head. "No, I trusted the people with authority more than the person with the evidence." His words settled heavily across the room. Daniel looked toward Richard. We all did. Richard remained silent for several long seconds before finally speaking. "Dr. Brooks." Elijah turned toward him. Richard took a slow breath. "I have spent years telling young engineers that experience is the most valuable asset inside this building." He glanced at the reactor display before continuing. "Today I learned something different. Experience without humility becomes a blind spot." Nobody interrupted him. Richard looked directly into Elijah's eyes. "You tried to protect this plant, this team, and every community depending on the electricity we generate. Instead of listening, I questioned your judgment before I examined your evidence. That mistake belongs to me." The room remained completely silent. No one searched for excuses. No one attempted to rewrite what had happened. Elijah stood quietly, allowing the words to settle without embarrassment or triumph. After a moment, he answered in the same calm voice that had guided the reactor back to stability. "The important thing is that we learn from the data before we forget the lesson." Lisa looked around the room at faces that had changed in less than an hour. The respect in their expressions had not been earned by rank, age, or title. It had been earned by preparation, integrity, and the courage to speak when everyone else preferred comfort over difficult truth. As sunlight filtered through the high control room windows and reflected across the polished floor, the room felt different than it had at the beginning of the day. The reactor was stable again, but something else had shifted as well. The assumptions that had once seemed as solid as concrete no longer carried the same certainty, and every person standing there understood that the quiet engineer they had underestimated had become the example they would remember long after the monitors returned to ordinary numbers. The emergency review meeting began less than an hour later, yet the atmosphere inside the conference room felt nothing like the confident gathering that had taken place earlier that morning. The same executives occupied the same seats beneath the same bright ceiling lights, but the certainty that once filled the room had quietly disappeared. Through the large windows overlooking the Arizona desert, the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the polished wooden table, reminding everyone how quickly an ordinary day could become unforgettable. A large display at the front of the room showed the complete operational timeline generated by the plant's monitoring system. Every decision had been preserved with precise timestamps. Every warning, every command, every response. Facts now stood where opinions had once spoken the loudest. Richard Coleman remained standing instead of taking his usual seat at the head of the table. His eyes rested on the event log for several long seconds before he finally turned toward the people gathered around him. "Before we discuss procedures," he said calmly, "there is something more important that needs to happen first." The room became completely silent. Richard looked directly at Dr. Elijah Brooks, who had quietly taken a seat near the middle of the table rather than at the front. Elijah still carried the same notebook that had accompanied him through every shift since joining the plant. Richard walked across the room until he stood beside him. "Dr. Brooks," he said, his voice steady but unmistakably sincere, "this morning I dismissed your professional judgment without giving your analysis the attention it deserved. I allowed assumptions to outweigh evidence, and I allowed authority to silence expertise. For that, I owe you an apology." Nobody interrupted. Even the air conditioning seemed quieter than before. Richard continued. You attempted to protect every employee in this facility and every family depending on the electricity produced here. Instead of listening, I questioned your credibility. That decision was mine, and I accept full responsibility for it. Elijah remained silent for a moment before slowly standing. Every eye in the room followed him. Many expected anger. Others expected a lecture. Some anticipated years of frustration finally finding a voice. Instead, Elijah simply looked around the table at the engineers, supervisors, and executives who had shared one of the most difficult mornings of their careers. "I appreciate your honesty," he said quietly, "but I did not come here to win an argument." He rested one hand lightly on his notebook. "I came here to keep people safe." The simplicity of his answer settled over the room with unexpected force. Helen Mercer lowered her eyes before speaking. "I should have read your report instead of relying on my assumptions. I failed to do that." Elijah nodded respectfully. "We all make decisions with incomplete information. The important part is deciding what we learn afterward." Daniel Foster leaned forward in his chair. "You could have walked away when your credentials were revoked." Elijah smiled gently. Walking away would not have changed what the reactor was doing. Lisa Wynn looked at him with quiet admiration. "How did you stay so calm?" Elijah thought for a moment before answering. "Because panic never improves mathematics." A few people smiled for the first time all day. The tension that had gripped the room slowly gave way to something more meaningful than relief. It became respect built not on titles or seniority, but on character. Richard reached toward the conference table and placed Elijah's identification badge in front of him. The small indicator light had already been restored from red to green. "Effective immediately," Richard announced, "Dr. Brooks will lead a complete review of our reactor monitoring protocols. Every recommendation he makes will receive full technical evaluation before any decision is reached." No one objected. Several engineers nodded immediately. Daniel was the first to speak. "I would like to work on that team." Lisa smiled. "So would I." Others quietly agreed around the table. Elijah looked at the badge for a brief moment before picking it up. "If we are going to improve," he said, "then every voice in this room has to matter, especially when the data challenges what we believe." Richard extended his hand across the table. This time there was no hesitation from either man. Elijah accepted the handshake with the same calm dignity he had shown throughout the entire day. It was not a moment of victory over another person. It was a moment when humility finally stood beside knowledge, instead of competing against it. Around the table, no one saw a young black engineer and a senior executive. They saw two professionals who had chosen truth over pride, and in that quiet decision, the future of the plant became stronger than it had been before the crisis ever began. 3 months later, the control room looked almost exactly the way it had on the morning everyone wished they could forget, yet somehow everything had changed. The massive display wall still glowed with rows of steady green indicators. The cooling systems continued their constant mechanical rhythm. Engineers moved between workstations with the same disciplined precision that defined every shift inside Palo Verde Nuclear Generating Station. From the outside, it was simply another ordinary day. Inside, however, every decision carried the memory of one extraordinary lesson. A new operating protocol had become standard procedure throughout the facility. Every safety briefing now began with one simple principle printed across the first page of the manual: evaluate the evidence before judging the messenger. The sentence was not attributed to any executive or government agency. Everyone knew exactly where it had come from. During training sessions, experienced operators now encouraged younger engineers to question assumptions respectfully, compare independent data streams, and explain unusual observations without fear of embarrassment. The culture inside the plant had shifted in a way no policy alone could have accomplished. Confidence remained important, but curiosity had become just as valuable. In one corner of the control room, Daniel Foster reviewed overnight reactor trends with a newly hired engineer. The younger employee hesitated before pointing toward a minor fluctuation on the screen. "It is probably nothing," she said quietly. Daniel smiled and shook his head. "Maybe it is. Maybe it is not. Tell me why you noticed it." She explained her reasoning step by step. Daniel listened carefully without interrupting. When she finished, he nodded with genuine respect. "Good observation. Let us verify it together." Across the room, Lisa Wynn finished updating a monitoring report before walking toward Elijah's workstation. She placed a printed analysis beside his keyboard. I found a small timing difference between the secondary coolant trend and the vibration model. Elijah looked at the charts and smiled. You almost certainly saved us several hours of troubleshooting next week. Lisa laughed softly. A few months ago, I probably would have ignored it. Elijah closed the report and answered, Now you know that small details have a way of introducing themselves before larger problems arrive. Richard Coleman entered the control room carrying nothing more than a cup of coffee and a notebook. Gone was the habit of assuming experience alone always produced the correct answer. Every morning, before reviewing operational reports, he walked through the room asking one simple question to engineers regardless of age or position. What do you see that I might be missing? Sometimes the answers were ordinary. Sometimes they revealed opportunities to improve. Every answer received the same careful attention. Respect had become part of the operating procedure. Later that afternoon, a group of university engineering students toured the facility as part of an educational program. They listened with fascination as employees explained reactor safety, redundant systems, and the responsibility carried by every person inside the plant. One student eventually asked the question everyone seemed curious about. What is the most important lesson you have learned working here? Richard looked toward Elijah before answering. Elijah gently shook his head, inviting Richard to respond first. Richard smiled. Technical knowledge keeps a reactor operating safely, he said. Humility keeps people willing to hear that knowledge. The students quietly wrote down every word. As the tour continued, one young visitor lingered behind for a moment. He approached Elijah with visible nervousness. Dr. Brooks, he said, sometimes I feel like people underestimate me before I even speak. Elijah looked at the student with calm understanding. You cannot control what people assume. The young man nodded slowly. Elijah continued, but you can control how well you prepare, how carefully you listen, and how faithfully you follow the evidence. Eventually, character speaks louder than assumptions. The students smiled with renewed confidence before rejoining the group. As evening settled across the Arizona desert, golden sunlight reflected from the solar fields surrounding the station and stretched across the concrete walkways leading toward the control building. Employees completed another safe shift and quietly headed home to their families. Inside the control room, the monitors displayed nothing unusual. No alarms echoed through the halls. No urgent voices filled the air. Elijah remained for a few moments after everyone else had finished their reports. He looked across the calm sea of green indicators, closed the same worn notebook he had carried since his first day, and gently placed it inside his bag. Before turning off the light above his workstation, his eyes rested for a moment on the words engraved beneath the plant's mission statement near the exit. Safety begins with integrity. He smiled almost imperceptibly, walked toward the door at an unhurried pace, and disappeared into the quiet evening, while the steady hum of the reactor continued behind him, no longer remembered for the crisis that almost happened, but for the day a single voice, grounded in knowledge, humility, and courage, reminded everyone that the strongest foundation of trust is not power, position, or pride, but the willingness to listen when the truth quietly asks to be heard.